All right, hi 30IB students, welcome back. I'm recording this video intro to Munro just so you have a sense of what the unit ahead is going to look like, and I'm doing it without the screen being constantly shown, so it's more like having me in lecture in class. Hopefully that's a good thing. You can, if you want, put this little window tiny up in the corner of your screen and open up our slides. That would be a really smart thing to do. So I hope your weekend's gone well. I hope that you're excited for the week ahead. And here's my take on Munro and Carver over the next couple of weeks. We're transitioning, as you know, from our novel units in 30IB, Handmaid's Tale and Pride and Prejudice and that comparison. And we're going into another fiction study to finish up your IB components. Now, with that study, we are still going to kind of keep a comparative framework in mind because that is something that happens so frequently at university in comparative literature, but also in your first year classes, that I think it would be useful for you to have a second go at doing some comparative writing. It's one of the more complex organizational tasks that you have in this sort of grade 12 year where you have to grapple with more than one work at the same time. And so both Van Leeuwen and myself feel like that's a really good thing to maintain even as we finish out your IB curricular content. So you can expect that. Having said that, with this online learning system and based on what you've already covered so far, Van Leeuwen and I are both choosing to focus more on a couple of key stories with Carver and Munro, and we're going to start with Munro first, which is the first for me. So we're actually going to get you to read Boys and Girls. It's one of her first stories in the little booklet course back, and Boys and Girls is probably her most famous. It's constantly used in the diploma, but it's constantly used because it's such a great layered story. Before I get too far into that, I want to give you a sense of how Carver and Munro kind of compare. The reason that we often teach Munro later is because she's a little bit more subtle at points with her literary realism than Carver. However, both authors are part of this sort of movement post Second World War, into more gritty, realistic fiction. I'd say like 60s onwards would have that more realistic bent to a lot of the fiction that came out. In Canada and in the United States, there's a lot of attention paid to small-scale stories, and as a result, when you're reading these, it's a bit of a culture shock compared to our dystopic world of Gilead, for sure, Atwood's world of Handmaid's Tale. It's also a little bit culture shocky in terms of what you're seeing happening in these two authors as opposed to the Regency in Pride and Prejudice, where there were big balls and there's action being delivered in terms of letters flying across different households. It's very quiet. It's like a zoomed in one scene storyline for lots of these short stories. And so I love that. It's kind of like a bottle episode on TV, if you know what those are. But it also requires some delicacy, I would say, in the reading of it, and some time. So what better time to run this than in a sort of self-isolating period or self-care period too? You have lots of time. Take this at a slower pace. So if you're on that second, or actually not second, but it's the fifth slide of our overall slideshow, it talks a little bit about Carver, Munro, and genre studies. Just remember that when you're reading these, you are reading them for that content, for that ultimate comparative task that we'll do. We'll do another essay, right, with these folks. But you're also trying to zoom in with a level of detail like we did in Pride and Prejudice when we looked a little bit at free and direct, indirect, and direct narration and some of the use of dialogue. So we're going to take a look at some small scale features of the genre, and it is a genre study. So how in these short stories you see the authorial intent being communicated, what kind of audience measures are in place to really engage, but also to challenge and maybe even leave some things ambiguous. How is that being done? We're looking at the techniques. And then commonalities that you might see that might be surprising, and or differences that really draw out what's special about each author. So you're going to be building those rhetorical devices back into your vocabulary and precision when it comes to your argumentation. That'll go really hand in hand nicely when we workshop your previous essays. So there is a workshop in the works. It's coming. Get ready. Okay. If you're on slide 6 and you're in your slideshow, then you know that we're doing a series of short stories that includes Boys and Girls. So a story of a young girl on a sort of acreage farm and her coming of age story. So there's nice little connections to your grade 11 year in Bildingsroman, the coming of age stories that we talked about with Persepolis. There's also great connections to the gender discussions we had with Othello, because you'll see increasingly in that story that gender is a significant identification that happens in the girl's world, and it affects how she sees herself and her future. So that's a good little one to take a look at. The way the story is told is also beautiful. Okay, but it's also heartbreaking too at points. Just be warned. Face is a great story about, again, you get to zoom in for one person's childhood and his relationship as a young person, and a misunderstanding slash, well, it's ambiguous, bullying incident? Is it just kids playing around? A controversy around a facial birthmark that one of the kids has, and then how that scrolls into and how it informs some decisions of both of the kids when they're later in life. So Face is an interesting one. Tricks is one that you'll be probably reading likely on your own. It has a lot of sort of Twelfth Night Shakespearean references. Like there's some comedic moments in it, and it's all about a woman who just is intensely focused on wearing a green dress that happened to allure a gentleman when she was attending a Shakespeare festival, and it's what happens over the course of sort of a small-scale choices in her life surrounding this sort of fantastical moment, this desire to reunite with him. So it's quite a fun one to read. Dear Life is a great little zoom-in story, like I said, about bottle episodes. It takes place in just a house, and it tells the story of this house and what happens when previous occupants start to arrive on the scene. Dimensions is the hardest one to read of all of these, so I'll give you the parental discretion is advised. There's a significant moments of family violence that happens in, well, not graphically in Dimensions, but is mentioned and is seminal for the main character. So it kind of follows a major incident in this family and how the main character years later comes to terms and carves a new path for herself. So it's fascinating. It's really hard for me to read because there is just viewer discretion is advised in terms of a manipulative relationship that goes about as wrong as it can go. Yeah, so that's it. That's Munro in a nutshell for these stories, at least. We'll really deal a lot with boys and girls together because it's such a good text to do comparisons with. But I'd invite you to read ahead a little bit and annotate as you go. And you can do that on PDFs. Find some new tools in your toolkit if you're not already using Notability or something else like that. Okay, in terms of the rest of the slides in your online slideshow, I'm going to just walk you through so you can have this as an audio recording as you read through these slides. Slide number 7 talks a little bit about Alice Munro and her narration, and that the characters tend to be of like a regular person, middle class background. And I say regular person, I mean it's regular for Munro, right? And so she will narrate in a manner where there is a little bit less sophistication, perhaps, than even the higher echelons of educated society today. But you'll see that the situations that she brings up tend to have phases and revisitations. So whenever there's an incident for one of these characters, yeah, they might kind of start off with a simple story, but as their story spirals and as there are repetitions and cycles, you're going to notice that there's some interesting changes, and you really pay attention to the contexts that start to happen around that cycle. So when you're looking at boys and girls, right, there's things that happen on a farm, and there's going to be some repetition of some cyclical events, but then what's different about the narrator each time she engages, and how do those relationships shift in subtle ways. You'll notice that she, like Carver does, she loves ambiguity. So if you were a fan of Wislawa Szymborska and the poetic ambiguity of her, you're going to like Munro, because Munro is much more approachable, I'd say, than Szymborska, but she certainly loves ambiguity to the same degree. And so look for those spaces where the author is leaving space, and then try to think and figure out, well, how is she doing that? Not just is she, and where, but how is she doing it? You'll notice this slide number 8 talks about a momentary illumination. We're going to talk a little bit about epiphany moments, like changes of mind, and also moments where there's potential epiphany, but the person doesn't actually make any changes. And so we'll talk about that with both Carver and Munro. What happens when there is this this opportunity and a character just doesn't make use of it? What does that tell us, and why does that happen? So that'll be really interesting to look at ambivalence in character attitudes and uncertainty as a form of deliberate artistic authorial choice. Okay, so if you're looking ahead on slide number 9, it talks a little bit about deceptively simple things, and that's really what this unit's about. It's about just unearthing archaeologist style, like whether you look at that as like sending out the pulses of imaging that we now do, or taking away layers of earth. It's a layered process of unweaving the structures that make this sophistication happen in Munro and Carver's writing. So considering that, please add to your toolkit the term literary realism. In slides 10 through 13, you're going to see me unpack a little bit for you what that term entails and the ways in which literary realism really captures that everyday, and why these authors are choosing to have very clearly demarcated kind of like blue-collar worker people as their main centerpieces and their main characters under study. So please read through those slides together. You can. I don't think I have to do that right now on the video, but just be aware that there are, it might seem like it's like, well, why do I read the story? It's because there's something subtle happening with social barriers or with attitudes shifting, and you're looking often for this character trying to realize something about themselves, become a truer version, whether that's a good or a bad thing. That realization of what they value and who they are usually crystallizes to a degree, but again, there may be some times where it doesn't, and then you can talk about that. So I'm going to say the last 2 slides have you doing a task with the learner profile and with finding literary realism in boys and girls. That should be it for the week. There's a closing quick write just to make sure that you actually sort of have processed a little bit of that. It is one of many quick writes that will happen, like I said in earlier broadcasts. We'll choose the best ofs. You'll have a chance to edit your work. This is exploratory at this point, and so we can have some jump-off discussions in our class time. So thanks so much for your attention. I hope that's a good little overview, and I will catch you in Google Meets, I hope, if you can make it. Otherwise, it's an optional Q&A, so don't feel pressured. Just join us and have some celebratory discussion if you can. Okay, thank you 30IB students. Take care, pay attention to the class schedule this week. That overrides any other previous announcements, so keep up with that. And if you have any questions, you can contact me by email, okay? Thank you so much, take care, bye.